Hello everyone and welcome to another edition of the Sideswipe MMA betting podcast. Today we're doing a full card betting preview of UFC Fight Night Rozenstruik versus Gaziev. Before we get into that, I just wanted to apologise for not doing a podcast for the UFC Mexico card that has just been gone. I planned on doing it, but unfortunately life got in the way. I ended up losing just under 0.6 of a unit on that card. I won't bother going into the bets, but if you do want to read my thoughts and opinions on what I did have money on, you can follow the link to my Reddit post where all the information is right at the top. But for now, let's get into this UFC Apex card. So we are back at the UFC Apex once again for this card. I believe it was originally supposed to be held in Saudi Arabia or somewhere else in the Middle East, but the powers that be supposedly told the UFC that the card they built wasn't worthy of the nation, so they pulled the plug on it. Considering that this event is being headlined by Rozenstruik and also a guy making his sophomore UFC appearance, I can kind of see where those people were coming from. But having said that, as a side effect of them canning the event in Saudi Arabia, we actually have a pretty exciting card by UFC Apex standards. The main card is a lot better than some of the recent UFC Apex events we've had in 2024, so I am actually looking forward to it. The main event is, however, probably the most underwhelming fight on the main card, because I don't really understand why the UFC is still infatuated with heavyweights. With the 5-round stipulation for main events, you've got the opportunity to trial some up-and-coming prospects and see how they handle those extra 10 minutes of competition. So why do you waste it on a guy who is going to finish the fight in round 1 or only has about 10 minutes worth of cardio to fight competitively? It really does baffle me. Heavyweight MMA does not get enough shit by the MMA community, and it needs to get a bit more. The guys still have the skill set of those from like UFC 25 and haven't evolved at all when the rest of the UFC is thriving in a completely different caliber these days. I would rather watch women's MMA any day of the week than heavyweight shit. Honestly, I skip most heavyweight fights when I'm watching a card live. Anyway, Shamil Gaziev returns for his sophomore appearance in the UFC, and he did look really good in that debut against Martin Buday. I was one of the rare people who was on Martin Buday in that fight. I did bet him, which has made me look like a bit of an idiot in hindsight. I have to hold my hands up. I wasn't really impressed with the regional footage of Gaziev or the fight that he had on Dana White's Contender Series, but clearly I just didn't have any faith in him, or I was trying too hard to dismiss his ability because he did look sensational in that debut. Rozenstruik, on the other hand, is a very one-dimensional fighter, and we know him pretty well. We know what he's going to bring to the table. If you stand with him, you better hope you've got the ability to fight long and defend yourself at range, or he's going to step inside, land a bomb, and it's probably the end of the night for you. Comparing the strikers that he's beaten, it's quite clear to see where Rozenstruik's level actually is within the UFC heavyweight division. He can beat the likes of Chris Daukaus, Augusto Sakai, and the ghosts of Junior Dos Santos, Alistair Overeem, and Andrei Arlovski, but if you put him against capable, high-level and rangy strikers like Alexander Volkov or Cyril Gane, and you can quite clearly see how limited he is in a minute-by-minute context. He relies on those big moments, he relies on the finishes, because if you're going to go long against him, you're probably going to have success. Furthermore, the other kind of losses on Biggie Boy's record are where he gets absolutely embarrassed by grapplers. Like I said earlier on, Rozenstruik's skill set is reminiscent of the kind of UFC fighters we had back in UFC 25. The floor is lava, and if he gets forced there, he's going to have the same amount of ability as a drunk guy outside a bar. Gelton Almeida and Curtis Blades demonstrated that pretty easily, and even old man Alistair Overeem won like 23 minutes of grappling-based attack against Rozenstruik until he got absolutely bludgeoned in the last minute of the fight. So how does all that relate to the lesser-known Shamil Gaziev? Well, he showed in the Martin Buday win that he's got some really nice boxing. He did get tagged a few times, but the difference in power kept him from harm. I certainly don't advise that he goes blow for blow with Rozenstruik because there is a clear difference in power here. But I also wouldn't count Gaziev out if he did strike with Rozenstruik, simply because he'll have movement, he'll have aggression, he'll have a volume advantage, which, as I said earlier on, those are the kind of fighters who are able to get the better of Jairzinho on the feet. The key angle for me here, though, is the grappling. Gaziev's Dana White Contender Series fight and the brief moments of grappling against Martin Buday showed that he definitely is capable of being one of those mauler types. Someone who locks down position on top and peppers you with short shots, bloodies you up, and is just a general high-activity menace and is clearly winning the round whilst you can't get up. I always say that heavyweight MMA gives you a massive advantage if you're a good grappler because the guys are so large and more round that they can't get back to their feet very easily and they don't have very good scrambling ability. Gaziev can definitely make use of that. On Dana White Contender Series, he did exactly that and showed exactly what MMA grappling is all about. He found top position, chained his way through a few transitions, made it to mount, took the back when his opponent rolled over, synced up the rear naked choke, and won the fight. If he aims to do that here, I think there's an argument to be made that he should be a pretty short favourite in this fight. The only problem with everything that I've just said is that neither of the impressive grappling sequence that we saw from Shamil Gaziev came from him initiating takedowns. I am concerned about how much he's going to be willing to instigate the grappling on his own behalf. He defended a takedown from Badai and followed him to the mat, and he landed a knockdown on Contender Series that started the grappling sequence. So can he be trusted to lean on a very obvious path to victory, considering it doesn't appear to be in his natural skill set? We can't say for sure, and Rozenstruik certainly won't be shooting on him and giving him the opportunity to have those scrambles. But it's just so obvious that the path to victory is there that I'm hoping that Gaziev has the intelligence to be able to identify it. I know I've said in the past that you shouldn't trust a fighter to execute a game plan that's not typically in their style, but you would think that Gaziev has the IQ to be able to figure it out here if he is a grappler, and he has shown himself to look capable. So I initially did all of my research for the fight and wrote down everything that you've just heard, not knowing what the betting line was going to be, thinking that Gaziev would be sitting around minus 175. I was pleasantly surprised to see that actually there was a minus 125 available at the time that I wrote it. It's definitely a bettable price in my opinion, and assuming that the price is similar to where it is at the time of me actually uploading this, I think the betting public will feel the same way and will begin to bet him once fight week rolls around. So I therefore have 2 units on Shamil Gaziev at minus 125. I think he has the potential to look minus 250 if he implements the grappling, and I don't think he's particularly outclassed anywhere but in raw power. At heavyweight, that obviously means a little bit more than it does somewhere else, so it is a concern. But at minus 125, you're allowed to have a couple of concerns about your fighter because they're only just a slight favourite. I think Gaziev has all the upside. We know what Jairzinho Rozenstruik is all about, and he's never going to be a champion or a top 5 fighter. So I think the minus 125 is worth taking. I took it for 2 units because heavyweight's not my favourite weight class and one that I particularly do very well in historically, but I'm happy to roll the dice. So 2 units on Gaziev. And in our co-main event, we have a light heavyweight showdown between Vitor Petrino and Tyson Pedro. Vitor Petrino is starting to look like a very interesting prospect in my opinion. He's got serious athleticism for light heavyweight, dynamite power, and he also showed the ability to wrestle in that win over Marcin Prachniow. He's being viewed as one to watch at 205 pounds, and he's probably one of the biggest prospects outside the top 15 in the weight class at the moment. I have famously called Tyson Pedro a role player in the past. I don't think the guy is a legitimate fighter that is committed to his career as a UFC combatant. I don't really know what the UFC's fascination is with some of these Australasian fighters. They groom them to be prospects by feeding them tomato cans, and then they don't really amount to anything because they take a step up and they get beaten. They did a similar thing with Jake Matthews when it was very obvious that he wasn't going to amount to anything special. Having said all this, I did actually bet Tyson Pedro in his last fight against Anton Turkalj, and I think I was pretty much on an island as the only one betting him as far as I knew. Honestly, that bet was more of a fade on Turkalj, and I thought it was a great stylistic matchup for someone like Tyson Pedro, but that just goes to show that every fighter has their day. Every fighter has a favourable matchup where even the worst guy can be bet on. I think this is a very different fight though, and I just don't think that Tyson Pedro has got it in him to go through the fire. Unless he starts shooting takedowns early and often, he's going to be under all sorts of scary pressure from Petrino, and I just can't see him weathering the storm. If these guys go blow for blow and start throwing their heaviest strikes at each other, I think Petrino's got a lot more tenacity, is probably the harder hitter of the two, and just has more of a will to win when the going gets tough. Honestly, Tyson Pedro's got a modelling career he needs to be worrying about. I don't see him going life or death blow for blow with a Brazilian. I do have a couple of question marks about Vitor, namely in the fact that he hasn't really faced any real adversity in his UFC career yet. I'm not really thinking that Pedro's the guy who's going to bring it to him though, but if you've not seen a fighter get tested, you've no idea what they're going to look like when things don't go according to plan. Some fighters can be absolutely amazing when they're the hammer, but terrible when they're the nail, so you do have to be careful of it. But I don't expect Petrino to be put under any serious pressure by Tyson Pedro. I think after a couple of minutes of Pedro getting his shit pushed in, he's just going to quit, and that's going to be it. Betting-wise, Petrino sits around minus 250, which I think is a bit generous, and I do think there is a little bit of value there. I think he should be around minus 300. When you look at the kind of fighters that Pedro has lost to, they've all been worse than Petrino currently is at the time that they fought him. They've been so much less dangerous. I just think that sometimes it's not so much about skill set and technicality, it's just about brute strength and your ability to find a finish, and as far as I'm concerned, Petrino definitely has that in comparison to Pedro. So I spent a little bit of time thinking about what I wanted to do with this, knowing that I did want to bet Petrino in a parlay, and I decided to combine him with Mateusz Gamrot. If you've read my stuff on Reddit, you'll see that I already have 4 units on Mateusz Gamrot, but personally I think that's a spot to absolutely hammer, so I'm happy to have another 2 units on Gamrot as well. The parlay of Gamrot and Petrino comes out at -105, so I bet that for 2 units. I think Petrino should be -300 here. I think he very likely finds a finish on Tyson Pedro, and even if he doesn't, I think he probably has the more capable minute-winning abilities and is the less likely guy to wilt when the going gets tough. So Victor Petrino is the value, 2-unit bet, -105 with him and Gamrot. Next up, the prodigal son of the United Kingdom, Muhammad Mokaev, returns to face Alex Perez in the flyweight division. And honestly, I don't know why the UFC have booked this fight. Why do they keep booking Alex Perez in fights? Since 2019, he has had 12 fights be cancelled. And the majority of them were his fault. Not all of them, but the majority of them. He's had cancelled fights due to weight misses, weight cut related illness on fight day, and a whole lot of injuries that have pulled him to the sidelines. Why are the UFC wasting resources and another fighter's time, especially a young prospect like Mokaev, when there's only like a 50% chance that Alex Perez even shows up? I honestly didn't even want to do research for this one because I felt like it was a waste of time and that this one's going to get deleted anyway. But on the off chance that they do actually make it to the cage, here are my thoughts. Another reason that it baffles me that this fight has been put together is because Perez is actually really good when he's able to perform at his best, which obviously isn't all of the time. He made his way to a title shot, and he really did underperform against Figueiredo, but I actually picked him and bet him to win the title that night because I thought he had a skill set that, as long as he survived the early onslaught, could look really good down the stretch. And honestly, I think I still believe that. So given that I do actually think Alex Perez on his day is a really good fighter, I don't understand again why they're feeding him to Muhammad Mokaev here. He's not even got any name value. If Mokaev wins this fight, people are going to think, oh yeah, Mokaev beat another washed up guy. But then when you consider that Perez on his day could actually be the one to beat Mokaev, it's all risk and no reward. So it's a stupid bit of matchmaking. I don't know why the UFC brass have done it. Onwards to Mokaev, and I think he's a really tricky fighter to get a read on. Obviously, we know his skill set and we know what he's capable of, but being from the UK, it honestly is a very confusing one. For those of you who don't know, Muhammad Mokaev was being hyped up as a UFC champion when he was an amateur. People were always talking about his undefeated amateur record and how he was going to set the world on fire when he turned pro, because he was so young. People just never shut up about him, and honestly, it's led to the point where I have very high expectations for him, and I'm not sure if my expectations are too high to the point where I scrutinize every little thing that he does wrong. Combing through his fights, there's just something about every single performance that to me just makes him seem a little bit overrated. The Cody Durden win was an exception, but it came in like 30 seconds. You honestly can't take anything of it. The Charles Johnson win came via decision, and Charles Johnson came in on short notice and was a debutant, so people expected him to win that fight probably inside the distance. However, we do kind of know that Charles Johnson's a little bit more durable these days, so maybe I give him a pass for that. Then he faced Malcolm Gordon, and he did actually struggle to assert himself against Gordon. It took him until round 3 to find the finish. When you consider that people like Amir Albazi and Jimmy Flick made light work of Malcolm Gordon, it shouldn't have taken Mokaev 3 rounds. I was underwhelmed by that fight. He then also took 3 rounds to finish Jafel Filo, making his UFC debut on short notice, which was underwhelming. And he also got caught in a fully locked in knee bar that everyone gave him so much credit for, when really, if you're talking pure jiu-jitsu, he should have tapped out because he could have injured himself beyond repair and completely ruined his career. And then after that, he hit a 3rd round submission against Tim Elliott, who probably is the toughest fighter and biggest name he's fought so far. And actually, if you look at the scorecards, Tim Elliott was 2 minutes away from winning that fight. He was 2 rounds up on 2 judges' scorecards, and that was also the way I scored the fight. So Mokaev actually lost the majority of that fight against Tim Elliott, who is never going to be a champion in his own right. So what do you think? Maybe I'm being too critical of Mokaev, or maybe there are some serious warning signs that he's not the messiah that people are saying that he is. Whether or not he makes it all the way to the title shot, I don't know, but honestly, if you look at some very nearby parallel universes, it's insane that Muhammad Mokaev is undefeated in his UFC career because he has nearly dropped the ball so many times. But anyway, back to this fight. Alex Perez is a decent enough striker that I actually think I give Perez the advantage on the feet against Mokaev. Obviously, Perez is also an All-American wrestler, which makes him a step up in the wrestling compared to anything that Mokaev has fought. Considering that Mokaev struggled to actually hit the majority of his takedowns against Tim Elliott, it makes me think that this one could get really interesting because I could see a world where Mokaev fails to get the fight to the floor and then actually gets pieced up on the feet by the superior striker. Unfortunately, Makayev is actually the better on-mat grappler and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu fighter of the two of them. So I do think he's got some serious submission upside here and could very easily get the tap out if they do scramble on the ground. We saw how quickly he was able to get moving and find a submission when the clock was ticking against him, given that he's finished like his last 3 fights by round 3 stoppage. The way that round 3 Makayev has made light work of Gordon, Filio and Elliott, it does make me question whether or not Makayev's capable of being like that from the get-go, and if he was aggressive and commanding with his grappling from the start, he would have success overall and probably be able to win this fight quite comfortably. So in regards to the betting line, I'm currently seeing Makayev anywhere between minus 350 and minus 250, depending on where you ask. Obviously, with him being such a big name in the UK and me being a UK bettor, the books are a little bit more biased towards him and will give shorter prices on that and a bit more value towards Alex Perez. Personally, I still think that the minus 250 on Makayev is way too short, and that so much of the narrative is built into the line, with Perez being frail and Makayev being a super prospect. But in reality, if these guys were just complete nobodies and that this was a debutante fight, and also assuming that Perez shows up looking his best, I think this one could probably be something like minus 150 Makayev, or maybe even closer than that. Obviously, there's no real way of knowing whether or not Perez is going to show up and not be a flake, and he obviously has been a flake at the best of times, so I'm not really sure I trust him. But I do think that Makayev is definitely being overrated here. Given the fact that Perez probably doesn't show up looking his best, I think that lands on about Makayev minus 175 to minus 200. Therefore, it's a pass from me because I don't see any value on either fighter. I strongly advise against using Makayev in parlays, though, this week, because I really do think that Makayev's luck is running out, and Alex Perez on his day has the capability to beat him, I'm sure of it. Next up on the main card, we have a fight that I absolutely hate as Eric Anders faces Jamie Pickett. Jamie Pickett is obviously really bad. He's barely UFC quality and he has a 2-6 record inside the organization. Somehow he's still getting spots on the main card. That's honestly a joke. I have no idea why that's happening. Like everybody else, I obviously will always want to immediately look and see who Jamie Pickett is fighting because I want to hammer his opponent, because surely there's got to be a bit of value on fading Jamie Pickett. But this time it's Eric Anders that he's fighting. I spent the first few years of Eric Anders' career believing the hype and thinking that despite all of the obvious signs of the contrary, that he would still become good one day. Those obvious signs include a complete lack of evolution, as Anders has not gotten better, he's arguably gotten worse since those early days, terrible fight IQ, the clinch fest against Jotko was shockingly dumb, and a complete inability to make in-cage adjustments. If you remember that Khalil Roundtree fight where he just got his leg chewed up, he made no adjustments at all and just could not figure it out. In short, whilst I once believed that Anders had the athleticism to be a top 15 guy with his potential, I now see him as a bit of a boneheaded power puncher that sometimes will show glimpses of who he could have been, but for the most part, he's not very good. I honestly don't think you need to do tape on a fight like this when it comes to a conclusion of whether or not you should bet it. Jamie Pickett is a guy that I could never back in the UFC against somebody who is quote-unquote UFC level, and Eric Anders is a guy that I couldn't back at minus 250. In fact, having written that, I think he's now minus 300, which obviously I disagree with even more strongly. In terms of where I would line it, I would say that Anders definitely has the advantages in wrestling, power and boxing. But if we were to see a closely contested MMA fight across multiple realms and it ended up as a split decision 29-28 for Jamie Pickett, I don't think I'd really be surprised. Pickett is awful, but he is well-rounded enough to be like a C- athlete across pretty much every area of MMA. And that leads me to kind of think that Anders should be around minus 225 to minus 250 here. Therefore, I don't want to be betting on this fight because I don't see value on either side. I've no idea why you would even want to bet on this fight in the first place. I always say to people that honestly, sometimes the best bet is no bet, and that passing can be as rewarding as a win if you don't get involved in stupid bets like paying the juice on Eric Anders. I don't feel confident on either side here, so I'm just going to pass, but Eric Anders probably should win. Umar Nurmagomedov, the cousin of Khabib, features in our next fight as he takes on promotional newcomer Beksat Almakhan. I didn't really look into this fight at all, if I'm honest, because Umar Nurmagomedov is like minus 700 on the betting line at the moment, and I'm recording this on the 20th of February, which means there's plenty of time between now and fight night. Probably end up seeing Umar Nurmagomedov at minus 1,000 or something like that. He's a future top 5 guy, perhaps even a future title challenger. I firmly believe that he deserves that kind of prospect status as well. He is a phenomenal fighter. I won't be betting against him. He's one of those guys I think will go all the way to the top, and when you can, you should bet him along that journey. So I don't see the point in doing tape on a debutant on the return when I'm not going to fade Umar, and I don't think you can get any value at all when he's minus 1,000. So what more can we say, just pass on this fight. And in the next fight, we have Matt Schnell versus Steve Erceg. Astro Boy came into the UFC and pulled off a really inspiring upset win against David Dvorak in his UFC debut. The company saw some value in him and then gave him a more reasonable fight for his sophomore appearance against Alessandro Costa, which he won. I was quite keen on him in that fight, and I did bet him for 3 units, I think. Neither fight was plain sailing for Erceg, who had to dig deep in the third round to secure the decision in a fight where he was looking ever so slightly better than his opponent, but not by a massive margin. He's incredibly durable, and he's a scrappy guy with some well-rounded skills. He's the kind of guy that you really do want to put your money on, really, because he's got that desire to win, and he doesn't have a massive weakness. Matt Schnell is basically the polar opposite of that these days. Similar to my concluding opinions about Alex Perez, which I mentioned earlier, I still believe Schnell to be a very talented and well-rounded fighter. It's just that his chin is made of glass. He probably has, pound for pound, one of the worst chins in the UFC at the moment. Even in the most advantageous of matchups, you can never be certain that Schnell's not just going to get put to sleep. Each of his last 7 losses, including all of his UFC defeats, have come via a stoppage. And it only gets worse with every instance because it's not like you can repair a chin. The more you get touched, the more you get knocked out, the more it deteriorates. So many fights in MMA simply come down to one man's toughness versus their opponents. And unfortunately, Schnell's chin just can't comply with that. We've seen Erceg fight tooth and nail to overcome adversity and win those all-important third rounds before. And Schnell manages to always turn fights into chaotic wars. So in a fight like this, whether it goes the distance or whether it doesn't, I think you have more confidence in Steve Erceg on a minute-by-minute basis, seeing as he's going to fight for your money and he's going to be there to fight for your money. However, skill for skill, I do actually think that Schnell might be the better fighter of the two of them. He's obviously the more experienced, and we've already seen Erceg be tested quite hard against Dvorak and Costa, who I would definitely consider a step lower than Matt Schnell in terms of overall capability as far as the UFC range is concerned. Another key aspect to this fight is the fact that Steve Erceg really isn't a hard hitter. He has just 1 KO victory to his name in 12 attempts, and he didn't seem super dangerous with any of the strikes that he landed in his 2 UFC fights so far. So in regards to the betting line for this, Erceg currently sits at -300, which instinctively does feel a little bit ridiculous considering I think Schnell might be the more capable fighter skill for skill. But I can't bring myself to bet Matt Schnell on the return for that reason alone. I know how frail he is, and I know what you're getting into if you're going to put money on him. He could win 14 minutes of this fight, and I'd still be worried about him getting finished. So do I really want to take years off my life with the stress and the nerves I'm going to have of this fight in play if Schnell doesn't get flatlined early? No, I don't want to do that. So it's obviously no bet for me. I reckon Erceg should probably be about -200 just because if this fight does go the distance, things are going to look very close, I imagine, but on the judges' scorecards. So Erceg with the finishing upside and the damage upside, but Schnell with the actual minute-by-minute capabilities seems about -200 to me. It kind of goes without saying, but taking a look at the price on Erceg by KO is an obvious route to take when the props do drop for this fight, but I think it's pretty common knowledge that Schnell's chin is made of glass, so I don't think the books are going to give you a freebie on that one. It's worth a look anyway, but I don't think you'll get what you want. Next up, Brazilian Dana White's Contender Series star Vinicius Oliveira takes on Yanis Gemori, who makes his sophomore appearance. Obviously, I knew next to nothing about Vinicius Oliveira going into tape. I didn't even remember his Dana White's Contender Series fight. I'm not sure if I'd even seen it before, so that's where I started. And honestly, I wasn't really that impressed. I saw him as low volume with no footwork and a lackluster striking style that relies very much on counter-striking until he gets his opponent up against the fence where he goes batshit crazy and throws a 20-punch combination. He swings big and he leaves himself wide open for counters, which obviously is going to be a real concern as he enters a high level at the UFC and he isn't crushing cans on the South American regional scene anymore. If he ever faces a tight and technical striker, he will absolutely get roasted, I'm telling you now. The dude definitely has power though, because the knockout that he landed was sensational and probably one of the best ones of the season, I would imagine. It was absolutely brutal. He had his opponent panicking pretty early, so it was pretty obvious that the power was there, so I very much doubt that he's going to be the one being walked down by any of his opponents. He's going to be the one swinging the hammer, very much going to be the one leading the dance, and I think that that's key in a fight like this. Yanis Gamori, unfortunately, doesn't inspire any confidence on the return, as much as I was hoping he would. I'm not really sure what his style is. He's evasive and he has really good footwork. He likes to keep to the outside and throw a leg kick or just a one-punch combination and dart in and out. But all he really seems interested in doing is flailing some punches and landing that leg kick in an attempt to look busy in the eyes of the judges. I don't feel like he wants to hurt his opponent. In his UFC debut, he could have fought William Gomez for multiple hours, and I still don't think he would have landed anything of significance and hurt the fellow Frenchman. Honestly, how that guy has 3 knockout wins, I have no idea. I did actually see one of them, and it was like one of those flush knee knockouts. But aside from that, I just don't see him putting anyone away. So this is unfortunately a spot where, as much as I was keen to fade Vinicius Oliveira, I absolutely cannot trust Yanis Gamori to be the one playing executioner, and ideally I would also like to fade him. The difference in dangerousness and power should be absolutely massive here, and as I said earlier, it's going to be Vinicius Oliveira who's going to be walking his opponent down. Yanis Gamori can play the matador all he wants, but evasiveness and defensiveness doesn't actually score points in the eyes of the judges. You have to do damage, and I don't think he's capable of it. Yanis staying on his bike probably isn't going to be enough to win rounds, so I do really struggle to see where he wins this unless Vinicius Oliveira has a massive gaping hole in his game that we haven't seen yet. So I don't really think either guy deserves to be a big favourite here because they're both incredibly flawed. But power is a huge trump card when it comes to the judges and also finishing ability these days, and you have to factor that into the line here. Oliveira is likely to be the one leading the dance, so I do side with him on the betting line quite heavily, despite the fact that I don't think he's very good. So it kind of lines me up having it very similar to the books, where I'd say Vinicius Oliveira probably deserves to be minus 200. Seeing as I can currently get him at minus 160, I therefore pulled the trigger on a 2-unit bet on Vinicius Oliveira, which doesn't fill me with a whole lot of confidence, seeing as I actually was looking to fade the guy, but value is value. And in our next fight, we have Javid Basharat versus Ayman Zahabi. It's a testament to how stacked the bantamweight division is in the UFC that Javid Basharat isn't a ranked name yet. He hasn't proven himself enough just yet against suitable opponents, but for my money, he's definitely capable of beating some of the UFC's top 15 already, and undoubtedly I think his name will definitely be amongst those one day. Ayman Zahabi, on the other hand, is the underrated gift that keeps on giving, if you like, underdogs. He was once regarded as one of the worst fighters on the UFC roster, and everyone saw him as a guy who was just riding the coattails of his brother, who, if you don't know, is a legendary coach who is responsible for Georges St-Pierre. Ayman Zahabi, on the other hand, was losing unanimous decisions to the likes of Vince Morales a few years ago, who is obviously not a very good fighter and got cut from the UFC pretty quickly. Ayman is currently on a 3-fight winning streak, which came as a surprise to many, myself included, as he came through as an underdog on each occasion as well. Looking back at those fights, he scored round 1 KOs very early against Arichi Lang and Draco Rodriguez, who one of them's already been cut, and Arichi Lang does not have long left until he is cut. And he also benefited from the bizarre mental capitulation of Ricky Tercios. Ricky Tercios is a weird guy because we used to think of him as someone who actually had a lot of potential, but it was in that Zahabi fight where he just fought like shit. So really, I do think that was one of those spots where Tercios lost himself the fight, as opposed to Ayman actually being superior skill for skill. So as you can see, the matchups and results that Zahabi has had in recent years really have flattered him, and he still hasn't actually managed to overturn the negative strike differential that he racked up in his early UFC days, or even improve on the 14% takedown accuracy that he has. So whilst he is on a 3-fight winning streak, if you look at his historic statistics in the organisation, he is still underperforming and has underperformed his whole career. Such a story of racking up wins as an underdog can only go on for so long though, and the UFC matchmakers have given Zahabi possibly the toughest reasonable matchup that they could at this level within the rankings. Javid is a supremely well-rounded fighter who seemingly has no holes in his game aside from killer instinct and serious power. He can look good striking, wrestling, or even on the mat, and I think that he will look better than Ayman Zahabi in every aspect of this fight aside from raw power. Hopefully it doesn't come to that. With Javid therefore likely to make this one look really easy outside of some round 1 scares, it really isn't surprising to see him at minus 450 at the moment and currently rising probably up to about minus 600 by fight day. I moved in super early on this one when the line originally came out, and I parlayed him with Brandon Moreno when he was minus 350. I was really happy with the price that I got there, but unfortunately, as we saw from last night, Brandon Moreno lost, so that parlay is now dead. I'm very disappointed, but I do think that there is still a tiny bit of value left on Basharat at minus 450, as crazy as that sounds. So I have him now in a 3-unit bet with Kennedy and Nzechukwu, who is fighting in a couple of weeks' time. That parlay comes out at minus 175, and I'll be playing it for 3 units. Our next fight sees Englishman Christian Leroy Duncan face Claudio Ribeiro. I've been a bit of a Christian Leroy Duncan hater since he came to the UFC. I went on a big rant last time saying that he's a classic UK fighter, all flash, no substance, no seriousness. The UK love these guys who are going to create highlight reels and be brash and cocky on the microphone. Your Paddy Pimblets, your Conor McGregors, I know he's Irish, but same thing. They don't really give a shit about somebody being a technical fighter because we don't get behind Leon Edwards and Arnold Allen, despite them being the 2 best fighters that the UK's ever had. But I digress once again. Christian Leroy Duncan did put in a pretty decent performance against Dennis Talulan in his last fight. It's a low-level opponent, but I do give him credit. He dealt with him accordingly, as he should. So in this fight, he faces Claudio Ribeiro, who is a Brazilian powerhouse who's all about being physically imposing instead of being technical. He's 1-2 in the UFC so far, and his only win came against Joseph Holmes, who isn't very good. He just marched him down, bullied him when the takedowns didn't appear to be working, and it was pretty much one-way traffic. Ribeiro isn't going to be able to walk Duncan down like he did Joseph Holmes because the Englishman has much better footwork and general ring craft, which should allow him to create the distance that he needs, circle away from that power hand, and use straight shots to outland his opponent and hopefully find a finish along the way. Duncan's obviously going to have to be extremely careful, but outside of an explosive round 1 finish, I think he should be just fine. Duncan should be the more competent minute winner though, obviously, so he does deserve favoritism, as you should really expect fighters not to hit that limited path to victory. And yeah, Duncan should style on him as long as he doesn't get knocked out. I think minus 250 sounds about right. Duncan is a decent parlay piece if you were looking for one. The final fight of the card is a showdown between Loic Radzhabov and debutant Abdul Karim Al-Salwadi, but I'm not going to break that fight down because, as we know, Al-Salwadi is a debutant, and I don't really have much to say about Radzhabov without going into tape. I'd rather focus on an upcoming week, seeing as there are so many betting lines out at the moment, so I'm just going to skip that fight. That therefore means we've come to the end of the breakdowns. Just going to quickly run through the bets that I have for this card, as I always do. So we have 2 units on Shamil Gaziev at minus 125, 2 units on Vitor Petrino and Mateus Gamrot to win at minus 105, 2 units on Christian Leroy Duncan to win at minus 135, which is parlayed with the over 1.5 rounds from UFC Mexico's co-main event, 2 units on Vinicius Oliveira at minus 160, and a 3-unit parlay of Javid Basharat and Kennedy and Nzechukwu. The latter half obviously takes place in a couple of weeks. Finally, I've listed some parlay pieces that I think are pretty good shouts, and I have a 0.25 unit bet on them at plus 664. They are Shamil Gaziev, Vitor Petrino, Javid Basharat, Vinicius Oliveira, and Christian Leroy Duncan. And finally, my dog of the week. I don't really like any of the underdogs on this card, so I feel like I always have to pick one. I guess it's Matt Schnell, simply because I do think he can be very competitive, but I won't be betting him, and I don't really recommend that you do either. But yeah, that's the entire card. I'll be back next week for the pay-per-view.